She did not enter Mossad through ambition or ideology. She entered through observation. Long before anyone spoke to her about intelligence work, long before her name was written in a classified file, she was already doing what spies do best, watching patterns others ignored. She noticed delays that didn't match schedules, deliveries that arrived too early to be honest, conversations that ended a second too quickly when she approached. None of it seemed dramatic. All of it mattered. Her leg injury came years earlier, the result of a civilian accident that permanently altered her gait. Multiple surgeries saved her mobility, but not her balance. She walked with a visible limp, sometimes using a cane, sometimes not. The pain was real, the limitation was permanent, and the world treated her differently because of it. People looked past her. In offices, she was spoken over. In public spaces, she was given distance. In tense environments, she was categorized instantly: non-threat, non-factor, background noise. What most people never realized was that the silence they created around her gave her time. Time to listen, time to remember, time to connect details that didn't want to be connected. Mossad's attention was first drawn to her through data, not personality. Analysts noticed that reports tied to her civilian logistics role showed an unusual accuracy rate. Discrepancies were flagged before audits. Errors were caught before consequences appeared. When questioned informally, she never speculated. She explained, calmly, clearly, with unsettling precision. That triggered a quiet review. Background checks followed, psychological assessments, long-term observation that she never noticed. The conclusion surprised even seasoned recruiters. Her physical limitation was not a weakness in her profile. It was a structural advantage. She had spent years adapting to discomfort without complaint. She tolerated pain without urgency. She understood patience at a level most operatives never reached. More importantly, she had mastered something that cannot be taught easily in training: being underestimated without resentment. When Mossad finally approached her, there was no dramatic reveal. No badge, no name, just a conversation that felt almost casual. They asked her whether she noticed how people stopped watching once they decided she wasn't dangerous. She said yes. That answer mattered more than anything else. Training did not try to turn her into something she wasn't. There was no attempt to make her faster, stronger, or more aggressive. Instead, Mossad refined what already existed: observation under stress, memory under distraction, emotional neutrality under pressure. She learned how to disappear without leaving, how to remain present without being counted. Her limp became part of her identity, not as deception, but as truth used strategically. In environments where weapons, radios, or rigid posture attracted scrutiny, she blended effortlessly. Guards waved her through faster. Questions softened. Suspicion evaporated. Years later, when the October 7th attack shattered assumptions and exposed intelligence blind spots across the region, Mossad faced a familiar problem with unfamiliar urgency. The architect behind the attack was not visible digitally. He avoided phones, avoided routines, avoided anything that could be traced. Technology failed where humans had always failed before: inside trust networks, family structures, and quiet logistical support systems. The hunt required someone who could move slowly without urgency, exist without friction, and ask questions that sounded harmless. Her name resurfaced. Some objected. The environment was unstable. The risks were extreme. But senior handlers understood something others missed: she did not look like a hunter. And that was precisely why she was dangerous. Her briefing was short and stripped of drama. No photographs, no names, just a principle. She was not being sent to hunt a man. She was being sent to study the spaces around him, the overlooked helpers, the quiet facilitators, the invisible human infrastructure that allowed someone to remain untouchable. She accepted without hesitation, not because she believed herself exceptional, but because she understood a truth intelligence agencies learn the hard way. The most effective operatives are rarely the ones who look capable. They are the ones no one thinks to watch. She entered the field without crossing a border. That was the first misconception people later made about her mission: that it began with movement. In reality, it began with stillness. With learning how a hunted man survives not by hiding himself, but by distributing his existence across others. The first weeks after October 7th were chaotic. Everyone was searching for the same thing: a location, a signal, a mistake. Mossad analysts flooded maps with data points, intercepted communications, and reconstructed timelines down to the minute. But the picture remained incomplete. Every trail ended one step before the target. That was where she came in. Her assignment was deliberately small, almost unimpressive on paper. She was inserted under a civilian humanitarian pretext, one that justified slowness, medical needs, and constant interaction with people who lived on the margins of attention. She did not carry classified equipment. No encrypted phone, no visible handler. Her limp explained delays. Her discomfort explained pauses. Her presence explained nothing. She began by observing routines that others found too mundane to record. Who delivered medicine after sunset? Who carried messages without phones? Who always arrived late and left early? She noticed how certain names were spoken softly, never written. How some houses never hosted strangers but always seemed supplied. How certain women, widows, aunts, sisters, moved freely between spaces that should have been disconnected. This was not the mastermind circle. This was his buffer. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was never directly. Her questions were wrapped in inconvenience, curiosity, or personal frustration. People answered because it felt easier than not answering her. Because correcting her felt harmless. Her injury helped in ways no cover story ever could. In tense environments, people rush to reduce complexity. They simplify threats. A woman with a disabled leg was simplified immediately. She was allowed into rooms others weren't. Allowed to sit when others were questioned. Allowed to wait without being rushed. And waiting was her greatest strength. Over time, patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, but consistent ones. A courier who avoided certain routes. A local fixer who never accepted payment directly. A man who didn't attend meetings but always knew their outcome. She never reported conclusions. She reported fragments, times, distances, behaviors that repeated themselves without explanation. Mossad analysts assembled those fragments into models that technology alone could never produce. Slowly, a shape began to form, not of a man, but of movement around him. Safe zones that shifted predictably. Windows of silence that coincided with specific gatherings. Human signals instead of electronic ones. At one point, she realized something critical. The mastermind wasn't hiding from surveillance. He was hiding inside trust. No devices. No fixed shelter. Just people who believed they were protecting something sacred, something necessary. People who would never betray him, not because of fear, but because of belief. That made him harder to reach. And it made her presence more dangerous. There was a moment, small, easily missed, when she understood she was close. A conversation stopped when she entered a room, not abruptly, but gently. The kind of pause that happens when people forget someone is there, then remember too late. For the first time, she felt eyes measure her instead of dismiss her. She adjusted nothing. That was the rule. When suspicion appears, do not react. Reaction confirms relevance. She continued moving at the same pace. Asking the same kinds of questions. Being the same inconvenience she had always been. But internally, she shifted. She began to track not just behavior, but awareness. Who noticed her presence? Who avoided her gaze? Who suddenly remembered her name? One name surfaced repeatedly, not as a leader, not as a fighter, but as a caretaker. Someone who arranged rest, not operations. Comfort, not commands. Caretakers are dangerous in networks like these. They see everything without needing to know why. She understood then that the hunt was entering its most fragile phase. Not because she was close to the mastermind, but because she was close to someone who knew how to find him. She sent a final neutral update. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just a subtle shift in phrasing that her handlers would recognize as a signal, not a report. The machinery began to move. And from that moment on, her role changed, from observer to anchor. If she disappeared now, the network would tighten. If she stayed, it would continue to breathe. So she stayed, walking slowly, watching carefully, waiting for the moment when the space around the mastermind became more visible than the man himself. She realized she was no longer invisible the day people began protecting her without being asked. It happened subtly. A chair placed closer to the shade before she arrived. A younger man insisting on carrying something she hadn't struggled with. Conversations rerouted so she wouldn't need to walk as far. None of it was hostile. None of it was kind either. It was management. Networks under pressure do this instinctively. They reduce variables. They control movement. And they begin by taking care of what looks fragile. For Mossad, this was confirmation. Her handlers never told her she had crossed a threshold. They didn't need to. The shift in ambient behavior was the signal. She was no longer just background. She had become part of the environment, and environments are monitored. From this point forward, every step mattered. She adjusted nothing outwardly, but internally her awareness sharpened. She began mapping not places, but moods. The way rooms felt before and after certain people arrived. The silence that followed certain names. The tension that surfaced when specific days were mentioned without explanation. The mastermind still did not appear, not even as a rumor. But his gravity was unmistakable. Decisions were made in anticipation of him. Routes altered because of him. People behaved as if he might arrive at any moment. A man who never appears but controls behavior is not hiding. He is being preserved. What unsettled her most was how ordinary it all looked. No secrecy rituals. No whispered commands. Just community patterns shaped around an absence. Children sent indoors at certain hours. Deliveries delayed without explanation. Lights turned off early, not because of fear, but because of habit. This was not a cell. It was an ecosystem. Her reports became more abstract. She stopped describing individuals and focused on relationships. Who deferred to whom without speaking? Who never sat with their back to a wall? Who watched doorways even during casual conversation? Mossad analysts cross-referenced her observations with historical models from other theaters, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. The conclusion was uncomfortable but consistent. The mastermind was not protected by fighters. He was protected by routine. And routines are hardest to break. Then came the first real test. A security check that shouldn't have happened. She was stopped gently, almost apologetically, by someone who had never questioned her before. No weapons drawn. No raised voices. Just a request to wait while something was clarified. This was not an arrest. It was calibration. They were measuring how much she mattered. She waited. Not tensely. Not passively. She complained about her leg. About the heat. About the inconvenience. She asked if she could sit. She made the delay about herself, not them. This disarmed the moment. Eventually, she was waved through with embarrassed smiles. Apologies. Offers of assistance. The network corrected itself, deciding she was still not worth the friction. But the message was clear. She had reached the edge of tolerance. That night, she did something she had avoided until then. She deliberately missed a routine appearance. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed by those who paid attention. Absence is a louder signal than presence. The reaction came faster than expected. Someone checked on her. Someone else asked questions disguised as concern. A third person mentioned, casually, that certain movements would be paused, until things settled. That sentence mattered. Until things settled, meant something had shifted. Something external. Something upstream. Mossad interpreted it as confirmation that the mastermind had been alerted, not to her specifically, but to environmental risk. He was moving, not fleeing, repositioning. She understood then that her role was no longer just to observe, but to hold space. By remaining predictable, limited, and non-threatening, she created a reference point. As long as she stayed where she was, analysts could measure deviations around her. She became a fixed coordinate in a moving system. And somewhere beyond her reach, a man who believed himself untouchable began adjusting his world, unaware that the smallest, slowest figure in that world had already reshaped it. She did not need to see him. She only needed him to move. Movement creates noise, not the kind satellites detect or microphones capture, but the subtle disturbance that travels through human systems when something valuable is relocated. She felt it before she could describe it. The rhythm of the place changed. People arrived earlier than usual, left later, spoke less freely. Routines that had been stable for months began to flex. This was the window Mossad had been waiting for. Her handlers did not give her new instructions. That would have been a mistake. Any shift in her behavior now would ripple outward too quickly. Instead, they let her continue exactly as she had, slow, predictable, unremarkable. What changed was how her presence was used analytically. Every deviation around her became a data point. Every hesitation, a signal. She began noticing secondary movements, support structures relocating before the core. A medical contact suddenly unavailable. A trusted courier replaced by someone less experienced. A house that no longer received visitors, yet remained stocked. These were not defensive actions. They were preparations. The mastermind was not disappearing, he was compressing. Tightening the circle. Reducing exposure by concentrating trust into fewer hands. That kind of behavior only happens when someone believes a threat exists but doesn't yet know where it is. She was close enough now that one wrong interaction could collapse everything. So she leaned further into limitation. She allowed herself to appear more tired, more frustrated. She missed steps, asked for help more often, became, in their eyes, a complication, not a concern. Someone to be worked around, not worked against. This was deliberate. Threats invite elimination. Complications invite accommodation. During this phase, she learned more from silence than conversation. Certain names stopped being mentioned entirely. Certain paths were no longer suggested. When she asked questions that previously produced casual answers, people now redirected gently, as if guiding a child away from danger. The network was protecting itself from accidental disclosure. That meant the core had narrowed. One evening, without warning, a trusted intermediary, a woman who had always been peripheral, sat beside her longer than usual. No agenda, no questions, just presence. They spoke about discomfort, about aging, about bodies that don't cooperate. This was not coincidence. In covert networks, empathy is a test. Shared vulnerability creates perceived safety. The woman was measuring whether she could speak freely around her, or whether silence was safer. She listened, she nodded, she offered nothing that could be repeated. The next day, a quiet rule change. A specific time window, previously active, went completely dead. No movement, no activity, no explanations. Dead zones are revealing. They mean something important passed through recently, or is about to. Mossad's analysts aligned her timeline with other intelligence fragments, financial shifts, intercepted rumors, sudden absences in unrelated areas. The pattern was unmistakable now. The mastermind had relocated into a more intimate shelter, one that relied almost entirely on human shielding. Families, caretakers, people who didn't see themselves as participants in violence. That was the paradox he relied on. And that was where she was most dangerous. She did not push closer. That would have triggered collapse. Instead, she became a constant, present enough to normalize, limited enough to ignore. Her injury allowed her to linger near thresholds without crossing them. Doors half open, conversations partially audible, movements observed without being followed. At one point, she understood something chilling. The mastermind was close enough that if she had been anyone else, armed, alert, or visibly capable, she would already be dead. Her safety was built entirely on perception. That knowledge sharpened her discipline. Fear was acknowledged, then set aside. Emotional spikes were controlled. Curiosity was restrained. This was not the moment for discovery. It was the moment for confirmation. Then came the signal. Not a message. Not a meeting. A disruption so small most would miss it. A child, usually present, suddenly gone. A room once used casually now locked. A caretaker who stopped making eye contact altogether. This was it. The final compression before exposure. She sent one last update, shorter than any before. No speculation, just alignment. Her handlers would understand. The environment had reached maximum density. Any further movement by the target would create detectable rupture. From this point forward, events would accelerate beyond her control. Her role was nearly complete. All she had to do now was remain exactly who everyone believed her to be. The acceleration began quietly. No alarms. No visible force. Just the subtle tightening that happens when too many decisions are being made too fast by too few people. She felt it in the way conversations shortened, in how explanations disappeared altogether. People no longer justified changes. They simply enacted them. That meant authority had centralized. Someone was present now, physically close enough to matter. Her handlers did not contact her. Silence, at this stage, was deliberate. Any instruction would risk changing her rhythm, and rhythm was the last thing keeping the environment stable. Instead, Mossad shifted its attention outward, building concentric understanding around the space she occupied. She, meanwhile, did nothing heroic. She complained about her leg more often, asked for water, sat longer than necessary, became, intentionally, an obstacle. Not enough to provoke irritation, just enough to slow movement around her. Slowness forces repetition. Repetition reveals structure, and structure began to show itself. She noticed how certain paths were cleared before others. How some people moved with confidence while others waited for cues that never came verbally. How a few individuals carried a calm that did not match the surrounding tension. Calm is never accidental. It comes from certainty. The mastermind was close enough now that his presence stabilized those who served him directly, even as it destabilized everyone else. She did not see him. She did not need to. His proximity was written into behavior. Then something unexpected happened, a mistake, not by her, but by the network. Someone tried to move her. Gently, politely, under the guise of concern. A suggestion that she might be more comfortable elsewhere. That arrangements could be made. That it would be better for her leg. This was not kindness. This was clearance. They wanted her out of the zone. That single offer confirmed everything Mossad needed to know. She declined, not firmly, not suspiciously. She hesitated, asked questions, mentioned pain, uncertainty, inconvenience. Delayed the decision without refusing it outright. This forced the network to tolerate her presence a little longer. That delay mattered. It created overlap. In intelligence work, overlap is lethal to secrecy. It's the moment when two protective measures interfere with each other. When urgency collides with caution. She noticed new faces, never lingering, never introduced. She noticed doors closing more often, but not always fast enough. She noticed the absence of children entirely. This was no longer a shelter. It was a node. Her final contribution was not information, but timing. By staying, she prevented a clean withdrawal. By leaving too quickly, she would have erased the density Mossad needed to isolate the mastermind's position within the human terrain. Instead, she let herself be a delay. When the external action finally began, far beyond her sight, far beyond her control, it did not start with force. It started with synchronization, borders tightening, movements freezing, safe routes quietly disappearing. Inside the network, confusion replaced confidence. She felt the moment the balance broke. The calm vanished. Orders were whispered instead of assumed. People began asking questions they had never needed to ask before. The mastermind was no longer shaping the environment. The environment was closing around him. That was when her handlers finally sent a single instruction, coded and understated. Prepare to disengage. Her extraction was as unremarkable as her insertion. No rush. No drama, just a slow unwinding of presence. She left behind nothing identifiable, no devices, no contacts, no sudden absence that could be traced to cause. By the time she was gone, the space she had anchored no longer existed in the same way. The network had fractured into protective fragments, each too small to hide anything significant. Her role ended without confirmation, without celebration. She did not need to know the outcome to understand the success. Because the hunt had shifted, from uncertainty to inevitability. After her disengagement, the environment she left behind began to collapse under its own weight. Networks built on trust function only as long as that trust feels unbroken. Once doubt enters, even subtly, every action becomes suspect. People who once moved instinctively now hesitated. Silence replaced coordination. The mastermind's greatest defense, human loyalty, started working against him as fear of exposure spread through those closest to him. From a distance, Mossad watched the aftershocks. They did not rush to strike. Pressure was applied unevenly, allowing confusion to deepen rather than resolve. Routes that once felt safe narrowed, then vanished. Trusted intermediaries found themselves isolated, unsure whether caution or speed was the greater risk. The mastermind, now compressed into an ever-shrinking circle, could no longer move without leaving traces, not electronic, but human. Her contribution became clearer only in hindsight. By anchoring the network to a predictable presence, she had given analysts a baseline against which every deviation could be measured. Once that baseline disappeared, the distortions revealed themselves rapidly. Safe houses changed occupants too often. Couriers appeared where none had existed before. Protective behavior turned erratic. These were not signs of strength, they were signs of desperation. As pressure mounted, the mastermind was forced to rely on fewer people, and those people carried more weight than they were prepared to handle. Caretakers became decision-makers. Messengers became gatekeepers. Each role expanded beyond its design, increasing the risk of exposure. The very structure meant to keep him invisible now demanded constant adjustment, and constant adjustment creates mistakes. There was no dramatic confrontation, no cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, understanding accumulated quietly. Intelligence streams aligned. Timelines overlapped. What had once been a blur resolved into a narrow window of certainty. By the time confirmation arrived, the outcome was no longer in question. She never received details. That was intentional. Operatives like her are not rewarded with knowledge, because knowledge creates attachment. What she did receive was silence, the kind that follows completion rather than failure. No recall, no debrief beyond the essentials. Just a return to obscurity. The hunt did not end with her, but it became winnable because of her. And in intelligence work, that distinction matters more than credit. When it was over, there was no announcement. No confirmation reached her, no headline carried her shadow, no official acknowledgement marked the end of the operation. That is how Mossad prefers it. Closure is a luxury intelligence rarely allows its operatives. Instead, there was only the quiet certainty that the system she had helped destabilize would never return to what it had been. The mastermind's power had not come from constant visibility or command, but from being protected by belief and routine. Once those were broken, his influence thinned rapidly. Networks that rely on personal loyalty cannot survive sustained uncertainty. People begin to protect themselves before they protect ideas. The structure fractures, then dissolves. Her role in that outcome would never be written plainly, but within intelligence circles, it became a case study, not of technology, force, or speed, but of perception. Of how weakness, when understood, can become access. Of how slowness can outmaneuver urgency. Of how the most dangerous operative in a room is often the one no one assigns importance to. She returned to a life that looked ordinary. Her limp remained. The pain remained. Nothing about her outward existence suggested she had stood at the center of one of the most sensitive manhunts in modern intelligence history. That anonymity was not a loss. It was the final layer of protection. In internal briefings years later, her operation would be summarized in a single line. Target destabilized through human terrain penetration. No name, no photograph, just a method, and that was the lesson Mossad took forward. In a world increasingly obsessed with surveillance, algorithms, and instant dominance, the operation reaffirmed an older truth. Human networks are not defeated by force alone. They are unraveled by patience, misjudgment, and the quiet presence of someone everyone thinks they understand. She had never chased the mastermind. She had never needed to. She simply stood where he believed he was safest, and let the weight of his own system close in around him. That was enough.